The chair scraped back so hard it knocked against the rough-hewn table leg with a sound like a gunshot, and every head in the Rhodes boarding house dining room snapped up at once. Mae Merritt stood frozen in the doorway, her traveling coat still dusty from the road, her carpet bag dangling from one white-knuckled hand, and her eyes fixed on the small boy at the far end of the long supper table. The boy who was standing guard over the empty chair beside him with both thin arms spread wide, glaring at the three grown ranch hands who had been racing each other to claim it. "That seat is taken," the boy announced with the absolute certainty of someone who did not yet understand that the world could argue back. One of the ranch hands, a broad-shouldered man named Cutter with a sun-cracked face and a permanent sneer, laughed low and sharp. "Taken by who, boy? I don't see nobody sitting in it." "It is taken by Miss Mae," the boy said. "She will be here in a minute and she needs somewhere to sit, and it is going to be right here next to me." The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against the ears. Mae's throat tightened so suddenly that she had to grip the doorframe to keep from swaying. She had stepped off the stage that afternoon into the hard sunlight of Redemption, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1883, with nothing but a letter of introduction to a boarding house owner she had never met, a small inheritance she was not supposed to have spent to get here, and a secret that was already beginning to crack her open from the inside. She had not expected this. She had not expected a child's unwavering loyalty to a woman he had spoken to for exactly 40 minutes at the edge of a dusty street, while she waited for someone to point her toward her lodgings. She had not expected to feel the specific and devastating weight of being claimed. Then the door at the far end of the room swung open, and Eli Rhodes walked in, and everything Mae Merritt had carefully decided about her own future shifted 6 inches to the left and never quite went back. He was taller than she had imagined a boarding house keeper would be, with the kind of lean, worn-down strength that belonged to a man who had worked with his hands long enough that the work had carved itself permanently into his posture. His dark hair needed cutting. His jaw was carrying 3 days of shadow. He wore a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he scanned the room the way a man scans a room when he is responsible for everything in it, quickly, completely, and with a flicker of something careful behind his eyes that Mae would later learn was grief that had been taught to behave itself in public. His gaze found his son first. Then it found the standoff. Then, last, it found me. "Eli," he said, and his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be obeyed. "What is happening here?" "I saved Miss Mae's seat," the boy said, completely untroubled. "Cutter was going to take it." Isaiah looked at Cutter. Cutter looked away first. "Sit down, all of you," Isaiah said quietly. "There is room enough." And there was. There always had been. It was just that nobody had thought to make sure of it for me until a 7-year-old boy named Eli Rhodes decided to think of it first. Mae crossed the room on unsteady legs and took the seat that had been kept for her. She set her carpet bag down against the chair leg, smoothed her skirt, and folded her hands on the table with the careful composure of a woman who had been trained her entire life to show nothing when she was overwhelmed. Eli sat down beside her and gave her a look of absolute satisfaction, as though the whole matter had been exactly as simple as he had always known it would be. "I told you I would save it," he said. "You did," Mae agreed, and her voice only broke the smallest amount. "Thank you, Eli." Across the table, Isaiah Rhodes poured water from the pitcher into the glass nearest to her without being asked, and said nothing, and did not look at her longer than was polite, and she felt the careful attention of it like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades, steadying. She did not know yet that this was who he was. She did not know yet that the hidden motive behind his stillness was not indifference, but a man so accustomed to loss that he had built his whole self into a wall and then, one brick at a time, begun filling in the windows. She did not know that she was about to become, entirely against her own intentions, the thing that found a crack in that wall and simply refused to stop pressing against it. But she would learn. She had arrived in Redemption, Texas, 3 weeks after the letter that was supposed to explain her purpose had arrived ahead of her, and the letter had contained a lie. Not a malicious lie, or at least that was what Mae told herself on the long stage ride west from San Antonio, watching the landscape flatten and bronze, and grow enormous in that particular way that the Texas plains did, as though the land itself was attempting to make a person feel appropriately small. The lie had been her sister Clara's lie, written in Clara's careful looping hand on behalf of Mae, who had been supposed to come to Redemption to take up a position as a schoolteacher in the new schoolhouse the town had been building since the previous spring. Clara had written, with the best intentions in the world, that Mae was an experienced educator with 7 years in the classroom. Mae had 2, and one of those had ended badly in a town called Hargrove, in circumstances she was not prepared to disclose to anyone, least of all the hiring committee of a town she was planning to build her entire future in. She had left Hargrove with a dark past she carried like a stone in her coat pocket, not the stone of something shameful she had done, but the stone of something that had been done to her, something that the respectable people of Hargrove had decided to look away from because the man responsible was the kind of man that towns like Hargrove could not afford to lose, and Mae was only the kind of woman that towns like Hargrove could afford to blame. She had the letter of introduction to the boarding house from a cousin of Clara's husband who had passed through Redemption once and written back that it was a decent town, not yet too rough, with good soil and a school being built, and a boarding house run by a widower named Rhodes who kept a clean table and charged fare. The widower part had not seemed important when Mae read it. It seemed important now, in a way she could not entirely account for, seated at this long table with the evening light coming through the west window and low gold bars, while a 7-year-old boy helped himself to the bread basket and handed it to her before anyone else, with the authority of a small person who had decided she was his particular responsibility. "Eli," Isaiah said from his end of the table, without any particular emphasis, "let others reach for their own bread." "I did not let Miss Mae reach for her own bread because she is a guest," Eli said, and looked at his father with the serene logic of childhood. "You said guests come first." Isaiah's jaw did a small thing that might have been the suppression of a smile. Mae kept her eyes on her plate and felt the warmth of it anyway. The other boarders at the table were a collection that told the story of redemption in a kind of compressed shorthand. Cutter and his companion Walt, both ranch hands from the Delacourt spread to the northeast, a dry goods merchant named Holly's Bean, who wore his cravat crooked and ate with great enthusiasm, a widow named Mrs. Purvis who had come west to live near her son and found that her son's wife had opinions about that, and a young land surveyor named Graham who was maybe 22 and flushed every time Mae glanced his way. Mae cataloged them all with the practiced speed of a woman who had learned early that reading a room correctly could be a matter of survival. She paid particular attention to Cutter, who had backed down from the standoff with Eli but whose eyes moved over her during the meal with a slow, assessing quality that she recognized and did not like. She paid particular attention to Isaiah, who did not move his eyes over her at all, and whose attention she felt precisely because of its careful restraint. After supper, she helped carry plates to the kitchen because she had been raised to, and because she did not know how not to, and she found herself alone in the kitchen with Isaiah for approximately 2 minutes while he filled the washing basin from the pump, and she stacked things on the drain board. "The school board will want to meet with you tomorrow," he said, without preamble, filling the silence with information the way some men filled it with words they did not mean. "I told Holly's Bean to let them know you had arrived. He sits on the committee." "Thank you," Mae said. She hesitated. "I should tell you something, Mr. Rhodes." "You do not need to," he said. She looked at him sharply. "You do not know what I was going to say." "No," he agreed, turning to face her with his hands still wet from the pump, his expression level and without judgment. But I know that people who arrive in new towns carrying something they feel they need to confess to their landlord before they have slept one night generally do not need to carry it into the kitchen. He paused. Whatever it is can wait until you have rested. Me stared at him for a moment that stretched out like taffy, soft and strange and longer than it ought to have been. You are a very unusual man, she said at last. I have been told that, he said, and turned back to the basin, and that was the end of it. She lay awake that night in the small, clean room on the second floor, clean being the precise right word. Not fancy, not cold, but cleaned with the particular care of someone who wanted you to feel that your comfort had been worth their effort. And she listened to the Texas night, which was nothing like the nights she had known in San Antonio, which were full of near neighbors and dog sounds, and the faint clatter of a city going to sleep. Out here the night was immense. The stars, visible through the single window above her washstand, were so numerous and so close that they seemed almost dangerous, like something that could fall. She thought about Clara's letter and its lie, which was not a lie but was also not the truth, and she thought about what the school board would say, and she thought about Hargrove, which she was not supposed to think about. And then, helplessly, she thought about Eli Rhodes spreading his small arms across the back of an empty chair and announcing to a room full of adults that the seat was taken because he had decided it was hers. She thought about what it felt like to have someone decide that. To have someone take the trouble, unprompted, quietly, before you even arrived. She pressed her face into the pillow and felt something complicated and frightened and almost like hope. In the morning, the town of Redemption showed itself to me in the honest light of early Texas sun, which had no patience for flattery. She walked the main street from the boarding house to the new schoolhouse, which was a plain frame building still smelling of raw lumber, with 4 rows of benches and a blackboard that had been nailed up slightly crooked, and windows that faced east so the morning light would come in right. She stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides and felt, with unexpected conviction, that she wanted this. She wanted it in a way that had nothing to do with desperation or the need to escape Hargrove or Clara's well-intentioned interference. She wanted it the way she had always wanted a classroom of her own, as a place where she could be useful in the exact specific way she knew how to be useful. The school board met with her that afternoon in the back room of Holly's Beans dry goods store. There were 3 of them, Holly's himself, a cattle rancher's wife named Mrs. Garfield who asked all the most probing questions, and the town's part-time minister and full-time opinionated man, Reverend Callow. They had Clara's letter. They asked about her experience. Me told them the truth, 2 years, not 7, but 2 years of real work and genuine results, and she described the specific things she had done with children who came to school hungry or frightened or far behind, because those were the children she had been best with, and she thought they ought to know it. Mrs. Garfield listened to all of it and then said, "What happened at your last posting, Miss Merritt?" The room went quiet with the specific quiet of a trap springing. "A situation arose," me said carefully, "that made my position there untenable. I left of my own choosing. I can provide character references from the families of children I taught if that would be useful." "What kind of situation?" Reverend Callow said, and his tone had the particular texture of a man who already had a theory. "The kind," me said, and looked at him directly, "that is not relevant to my fitness to teach children arithmetic and reading." There was a pause. Holly's Bean cleared his throat. Mrs. Garfield looked at me for a long moment with the assessment of a woman who had done her own surviving in a world that did not make it easy. "I would like those references," Mrs. Garfield said finally. "You can have the position on a trial basis. 3 months. If the results are satisfactory, we make it permanent." Me breathed. "Thank you, ma'am." She walked back to the boarding house in the late afternoon heat with her heart knocking against her ribs and her chin up, and she had been back exactly long enough to hang her coat when she heard the sound of a child's boots on the stairs, and Eli appeared on the landing above her, his face carrying the expression of someone who had been monitoring the door. "How did it go?" he asked. She looked up at him. "How did you know where I had been?" Papa told me you had a meeting with the school board. He came down the stairs with his hand on the banister, serious and careful. He said I was not to bother you when you came back because you would need a minute to think. But I have been waiting a very long time. I got the position, Mae said. Eli's face broke open into the kind of smile that is still entirely unguarded, the smile of a child who has not yet learned to be careful with his own feelings. He came down the last 3 stairs in one jump and said, I knew you would. Papa said the school board were picky people, but that you seemed like a person who knew what she was doing. Mae's breath caught somewhere in her chest. Your father said that. He says things about everyone who stays here, Eli said, with the clarifying air of someone making sure she did not read too much in. He said Holly's Bean talks with his hands when he is nervous, and he said Mrs. Purvis is lonelier than she lets on, and he said he stopped. What did he say? Mae asked, and she should not have asked. She knew that even as she said it, Eli appeared to consider whether he was betraying a confidence. He was 7. The consideration lasted approximately 2 seconds. He said you were carrying something heavy and that this town might be good for that. Mae stood in the entryway of the Rhodes boarding house in the golden late afternoon of an October day in 1883, and could not for the life of her determine what to do with the feeling that sentence had just put in her chest. She found out, gradually and without any single dramatic moment of revelation, why there was no Mrs. Rhodes. It came in pieces, the way the truth about people always comes. A sentence from Mrs. Purvis at breakfast, a visible flinch when someone mentioned the name Anna in passing, the particular way Eli sometimes looked at the chair to his father's right as though he was checking whether anyone was in it. Anna Rhodes had died 2 years ago. Fewer than 2 years, actually 22 months, which in a small town is not quite enough time to have stopped counting the months. She had died of a fever that the doctor in Redemption had not been able to get ahead of, the kind of quick, unreasonable death that leaves the people around it with the helpless fury of something that should not have been allowed to happen. She had been, by all accounts, and by the specific soft quality that came into people's voices when they mentioned her, a woman of great warmth and practicality who had made the boarding house feel like something more than a business, who had known everyone's name and their particular food preferences and their trouble, and who had left behind a husband who had quietly and methodically turned himself into a person who kept the house running, and the table set, and the accounts balanced, and who appeared to have decided that wanting anything for himself was a luxury the situation could not support. And a son who was, Mae realized over the first weeks of her time in Redemption, compensating for his father's careful withholding of feeling by generating enough feeling for both of them. Eli had opinions about everything. He had opinions about which biscuits were the best at supper, and which ranch hand told the best stories, and which boarders were genuinely kind versus performing kindness for an audience. He had strong opinions about Mae's classroom, which he was not yet old enough to attend but had somehow managed to visit twice in the first 2 weeks on technical errands he had clearly invented, and he had the absolute unwavering opinion that she was the most interesting person who had come to stay at the Rhodes boarding house in as long as he could remember. He saved her seat at supper every night. It was not a dramatic thing. It was simply a thing he did, arriving at the table a minute before anyone else, setting his hands on the back of the chair beside his own, and looking at whoever approached with an expression that communicated without requiring any words that this particular chair had already been allocated. Mae noticed the first time. She noticed the second time with a different quality of attention, something warmer, something that made her want to look at Isaiah to see if he was watching, and then made her want not to look because she was afraid of what she would see. She looked on the third evening. Isaiah was watching. He was watching with an expression she could not entirely read, something between the tender exasperation of a parent who sees their child doing something both foolish and completely right, and something else, something quieter and more private that vanished the moment he felt her eyes on him, and was replaced by the careful, level expression he wore the way a man wears a coat in cold weather. He looked away. She looked away. But something had been established, unnamed and fragile, the way the first frost makes itself known on a window before sunrise, not through announcement, but through the simple fact of having appeared. She taught her first full week of school in the third week of October, and it went badly and then well, and then badly again in the specific rhythm of any honest beginning. She had 17 children ranging from 6 to 14, 2 of whom had never been inside a schoolroom before, and 3 of whom had been told by their fathers with varying degrees of explicitness that they were too old for this and had not come willingly. The 2 youngest were twins named Nora and Jack Priestley, the children of a homesteader family that had settled 6 miles out of town the previous spring. They arrived the first morning holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white, and they sat in the front row looking at me with the expression of people who have been told something is safe and are reserving judgment. By the end of the first week, Nora had memorized the alphabet song, and Jack had decided that Me's explanations of numbers made more sense than his older brother's, which was the most trust a 7-year-old boy from a stubborn family could extend. Me walked back to the boarding house each evening with chalk dust on her sleeve, and the particular exhausted satisfaction of work that asks all of you and returns exactly what you put in. One evening near the end of the second week, she came in to find Eli at the kitchen table with his schoolwork spread out before him, frowning at a slate with the focused misery of a child confronting a mathematics problem that has not been cooperative. "May I look?" Me asked, setting down her things. Eli pushed the slate toward her with the specific surrender of a person who has been proud for long enough. She sat across from him and looked. The problem was a simple division, complicated by the fact that Eli had been taught a method that was slightly wrong, and had built 3 subsequent errors on top of it. She went through it with him carefully, the right way, explaining each step not as a correction of what he had been doing wrong but as a new tool, a better route to the same destination. Isaiah came in from outside while they were working, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway, and he did not say anything. He just stood there for a moment looking at his son and me bent together over the slate in the kitchen lamplight, and me could feel him there the way you can feel weather changing, a shift in the pressure of the air. "It makes sense now," Eli announced, with the emphatic relief of a child who has been personally wronged by confusion and is now vindicated. "Good," me said. "Do the next 3 on your own and show me." She looked up as she said it and found Isaiah still in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them did anything as simple as look away. His eyes were dark and steady, and they held something she had not expected: gratitude, real and unguarded, the kind that comes from watching someone be careful with something you love. It lasted only a moment. Then he said, "Eli, you are keeping Miss Me from her supper," and crossed the kitchen to the stove to check on whatever was in the pot, and the moment was over. But it had happened. Me excused herself to wash before supper, and went up the stairs to her room and stood at the washstand, splashing cold water on her face, looking at herself in the small mirror above the bowl, and had a firm and completely useless conversation with her own reflection about the specific inadvisability of developing feelings for a man who was her landlord, and who was still wearing the invisible shape of his dead wife like a second skin. She had come to redemption to build something. She had come here specifically because building something of her own required not becoming entangled in someone else's. She had made this argument to herself very thoroughly. The argument was not, she noticed, particularly effective. November arrived with a cold front that swept down from the north and transformed the Texas plains into something steelier and more forbidding, the sky going pewter gray and the wind coming through every crack in every building, with opinions about the lack of proper insulation. Me added a second petticoat to her school days and started bringing an extra shawl for the mornings, and the boarding house became, in the way that shelter always does when the weather turns serious, something more essential and more intimate than it had been in the warmth. People gathered more in the evenings. The parlor, which in October had been used sporadically, became in November the room where the boarders collected after supper with their reading and their mending, and their card games and their slow, comfortable conversation. Isaiah sat in the parlor most evenings now, not always talking, sometimes just there with an account book or a newspaper, and his presence was the kind that organized the room around itself without demanding anything. The way a hearth organized a room, simply by being the warmest thing in it. Mae was reading one evening in the armchair nearest the lamp, and Eli had fallen asleep against her side with his head on her arm in the specific, boneless way of a child who had simply stopped before reaching bed. And she had not had the heart to wake him, and she was now committed to sitting very still with a 7-year-old's full weight on her right arm, and her book held at a slight angle in her left hand. She looked up at one point and found Isaiah watching them with an expression so raw and unguarded that she forgot to look away in time, and he forgot too, and they looked at each other across the lamplight parlor with the sleeping child between them like a fact that required no interpretation. Something passed between them in that moment. Not words, not movement, just the acknowledgement of something present, something real, something that both of them had been pretending not to see. Isaiah was the one who looked away, but not quickly, and not with the smooth efficiency of avoidance. He looked away the way a man looks away from something he is not ready to face yet but cannot deny the existence of. He stood quietly and crossed the room and lifted Eli from Mae's side with the ease of someone who had done it many times, settling the sleeping boy against his shoulder, and Eli stirred but did not wake. "Thank you," Isaiah said, low, looking down at his son and not at Mae. "He is good company," Mae said, and meant it absolutely. Isaiah looked at her then briefly and said nothing else, and carried Eli up to bed. Mae sat alone in the lamplight with the warm impression of a sleeping child still on her arm, and the particular ringing silence of a moment that has changed something you are not yet prepared to name. The trouble with Cutter arrived before she had expected it. She had marked him early as the kind of man who required watching, but she had not anticipated him being the specific kind of trouble he turned out to be, which was the kind connected directly to her dark past in Hargrove and the reason she had left. His name was not Cutter, it turned out. Or rather, Cutter was a working name, a nickname picked up along a series of ranch jobs. His given name was William Creech, and the man who had made Mae's position in Hargrove untenable, the man she had been careful never to name in redemption, was named Thomas Creech, and they were cousins. She found this out on a Tuesday in the second week of November from Mrs. Purvis, who had been in Hargrove herself some years back and who mentioned it entirely without malice, the way information travels in small places, not as a weapon but as the natural consequence of a small world being small. Mae sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she had the conversation she needed to have with Isaiah. She found him in the barn on a Thursday morning before school, where he was working on a harness that had split at the buckle. The morning was cold enough to see breath, and the barn smelled of hay and horses and the particular dry warmth of animal heat. She told him all of it. She told him about Thomas Creech in Hargrove, how he had been a man of standing in the town, a merchant married, who had decided that Mae's position as a schoolteacher gave him access to her that she had not offered. She told him about the inappropriate attentions, the escalating pressure, the moment when she had made clear that she would not comply, and he had responded by finding a way to make it appear she was the problem. She told him about the quiet campaign of whispered doubt that had made her classroom first uncomfortable and then untenable. She told him about leaving because staying would have required her to be destroyed in order to prove she was right. She told him about Clara's letter and its exaggeration of her experience, not to excuse it, but because it was part of the same story, the story of a woman who needed a fresh start badly enough that she had allowed a small dishonesty to get her one. Isaiah listened to all of it without interrupting. He had set down the harness when she started talking, and he had not picked it up again. He listened with the full, still attention of someone who is giving what they are hearing the weight it deserves. When she finished, the barn was quiet except for the sound of the horses and the wind against the outside walls. "Is Cutter a danger to you?" he asked. It was the first thing he said, and it was exactly the right thing to say, going directly to the thing that mattered most. "I do not know," Mae said honestly. "He may know nothing about Hargrove. The connection may be coincidental. But you do not think it is coincidental," Isaiah said. "No," she said, "I do not." He nodded once, a slow and deliberate nod that communicated he was taking this seriously and filing it where it needed to go. "You were right to tell me," he said. "I will handle Cutter." "I am not asking you to fight my battles," Mae said, and she heard the sharpness in her own voice and did not apologize for it. "I am asking you to know what is in your own house." He looked at her directly. "I know it, and I will handle it. Those are not the same as fighting your battle for you." She held his gaze. "How will you handle it?" "By having a conversation," he said, "and by making clear that the house I run has rules that apply to everyone in it. And if the conversation does not take, by asking him to find other lodgings." It was so reasonable and so calm and so exactly what was needed that Mae had to look away from him because the alternative was saying something she was not ready to say. "Thank you," she said to the horse in the nearest stall. "Mae," Isaiah said, and it was the first time he had said her given name. She went still. "What happened in Hargrove was not your fault. I want you to know that I understand that clearly, and that no version of that story would change what I think of you." She turned back to him. His expression was exactly what it had been when she first walked in, level, careful, unperformed. It was not pity. It was not the careful neutrality of someone managing a problematic border. It was recognition, clean and simple and steady, the kind of being seen that she had not realized she had been hungry for until it was right in front of her. She said, "You are still the most unusual man I have ever met," and left the barn before she could embarrass herself. The conversation Isaiah had with Cutter apparently covered the necessary ground, because Cutter's manner at the table became markedly more distant, not hostile, just careful, the behavior of a man who has been reminded where the lines are, and has decided that the lines are worth respecting for now. He left the boarding house 2 weeks later, citing work moving south with the Delacourt herd, which was true enough to be plausible and convenient enough that nobody pushed on it. Walt, his companion, stayed on, and turned out in Cutter's absence to be a quiet and inoffensive man who had mostly been borrowing Cutter's personality for social ease. December came with a blue norther and Christmas preparations, and Redemption put up evergreen boughs that had been brought down from the hill country by the merchant supply wagon, and the schoolchildren made paper decorations that Mae strung along the schoolroom windows and felt genuinely beautiful about. She was not looking for what happened next. She was not, she told herself firmly and repeatedly, in a position to be looking for anything. She had the school, which was going well enough that Mrs. Garfield had hinted the trial period might be shortened, and she had the boarding house which had become, she noticed without meaning to, the place she thought of as home, and she had her own carefully maintained internal order which she was not interested in disrupting. She was not looking for it, and it found her anyway. It happened 2 weeks before Christmas, on a Sunday afternoon when the boarding house was quiet because most of the boarders had gone to the afternoon church service, and Mae had stayed behind with a headache that was mostly a headache and partly a need for silence. She was in the parlor with her mending when she heard Eli's voice from the kitchen, and then Isaiah's, and the particular quality of the conversation told her without hearing the words that something was wrong. She set down her mending and went to the kitchen doorway. Eli was crying, not the performative crying of a child who has not gotten what he wanted, but the deep, effortful crying of a child trying not to cry and failing, which is a completely different and much more serious thing. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his face turned down, and Isaiah was crouched in front of him at the same level, with one hand on Eli's arm, and his expression was the most unguarded Mae had ever seen it, tight with pain, with the particular helplessness of a parent watching their child grieve something that cannot be fixed. Mae started to withdraw, understanding she had walked into something private. Eli looked up and saw her. "Miss Mae," he said, and his voice was wrecked with crying. "It was Mama's birthday today and I forgot until after dinner, and now it has already been most of the day." Mae stood in the doorway with her heart breaking clean in half. Isaiah straightened slowly, and she could see the effort it cost him, not the effort of composure, but the effort of a man who was carrying grief of his own and was trying to keep it from pouring directly onto his son, which was its own kind of love and its own kind of exhaustion. "You did not forget her," Mae said quietly, coming into the kitchen. "You remembered today, that counts." "It should have been first thing," Eli said. "Sometimes grief is not on schedule," Mae said. She sat down beside him at the table, close enough that their arms touched. "It comes when it comes. Your mama would not have kept score." Eli looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "How do you know what she would have done?" "I do not know for certain," Mae said honestly. "But I know the way your father has made this house, and the way you are, and both of those things are what a person leaves behind them, and they tell me a great deal about who she was." The silence that followed was a full and serious silence. Isaiah had not moved from his position near the stove, and Mae was aware of him with every part of her, but she kept her attention on Eli, who was working through something with the focused labor of a small person confronting a very large feeling. "Could we do something?" Eli asked eventually. "For her birthday? Even though it is already afternoon." "What would she have liked?" Mae asked. Eli thought about this. "She liked singing," he said, "and she liked pie. Papa makes her pie sometimes still on her birthday, but he did not do it this year, and I think it is because it is hard." He said this with the devastating matter-of-factness of a child who has observed his parents' grief accurately and does not know yet that people sometimes need the observation left private. Isaiah said from the stove, "We could make the pie now." His voice was steady and quiet and cost him something to make steady and quiet. "If you want." Eli looked up at him. "Together, together," Isaiah said. Mae stood to leave because this was for the two of them and because she knew when to take herself out of a room. "Miss Mae," Eli said behind her, and she turned. He was looking at her with the directness that was his most characteristic quality. "Will you stay?" She looked at Isaiah, who had turned from the stove and whose expression was open in a way she had not seen it before, open and unsure and asking, not with words but clearly and completely. "If you would like me to," Mae said. She was speaking to both of them. "Yes," Eli said firmly. Isaiah said nothing, but he turned to the cupboard and took out the flour, and that was its own kind of answer. They made an apple pie that afternoon, the three of them in the warm kitchen while the December wind pressed against the windows. And Eli told me stories about his mother, the funny ones, the ones that made him laugh even now. The one about the time she had gotten into an argument with a particularly stubborn mule, and the mule had won comprehensively. And Isaiah added details occasionally in his low voice and sometimes smiled. And the grief in the kitchen was real and present and also somehow surrounded by something warm enough to bear. Mae did not know when she started crying. She became aware of it the way you become aware of rain gradually, by the fact of being wet. She turned slightly away and wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, hoping it had gone unnoticed. Eli noticed. Of course Eli noticed. "Miss Mae," he said, "are you sad about Mama too?" "I am sad for both of you," Mae said simply. "She would have liked you," Eli said with the certainty he applied to all his opinions. "I am sure of it." Isaiah was looking at his pastry dough and not at Mae, but she could see his profile, and she could see the movement of the muscle in his jaw, and she understood that he was holding something very carefully right now. "I would have liked to know her," Mae said. After the pie came out of the oven and had been divided with ceremony between the three of them, and the kitchen had been cleaned, and Eli had been put to bed with a full stomach and the lighter face of a child who has been allowed to mourn and been held through it, Mae found herself in the parlor again, nominally returning to her mending. Isaiah came in and stood by the fireplace, and after a moment said, "You were very good with him tonight." "He did not need anything from me that he did not already have," Mae said. "He just needed to be allowed to feel it." Isaiah looked at the fire. "I sometimes get it wrong. I'm trying to protect him from my own grief, and I think sometimes I protect him from the grief itself, and that is not the same thing." He was not asking her for reassurance or absolution. He was simply telling her the truth about himself, in the way he did without preamble, directly, with the kind of honesty that trusted her to receive it. "You are doing better than you think," Mae said. "He is a boy who knows he is loved and who knows his grief is not a burden. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal." Isaiah looked at her then, turning from the fire, and what was in his expression now was not guarded at all. It was the face of a man who had been living inside his own walls for 22 months, and who had just realized that someone had been quietly and patiently making themselves at home inside them without his ever having issued an invitation or having wanted to stop them. "Me," he said. "Isaiah," she said, and his name in her mouth was different from how she had been keeping it in her head, more real, more weighted. He crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest hers, not across from her but beside her, the way you sit beside someone when you are not performing anything, when the distance you have been maintaining has finally become more expensive than it is worth. "I do not know how to do this anymore," he said. "Any of this, wanting things. I have been doing something that I thought was sensible, and I think it might actually just be fear dressed up as sensibility." "I know something about that," Mae said. He looked at her hands, her mending hands, and then at her face. "You came here to build something for yourself." "Yes. I do not want to be in the way of that." "Isaiah," Mae said, with a gentleness that surprised even herself, "you are the least obstructive man I have ever encountered." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape that comes before a smile, the permission given to the face before the face responds. "I am asking," he said. "If I might be permitted to, I am asking if this could be something between us, at whatever pace is right, without pressure." Mae set down her mending very deliberately. "I would like that very much," she said. He exhaled slowly, like something releasing that had been held for a very long time. They sat together in the parlor with the fire and the December wind outside and said nothing else for a while, and nothing else was needed. Christmas in Redemption was a thing of unexpected joy. The town decorated the church and the main street with evergreen and red ribbon, and the schoolchildren performed a short program that Mae had organized with, she felt, a satisfying mix of dignity and genuine enthusiasm. The twins, Nora and Jack Priestley, recited a poem together with such earnest seriousness that half the audience was trying not to visibly adore them. Eli, who was not yet old enough for the school program, sat in the front row of the audience with the focused attention of a boy taking notes on how the whole thing was done, and at the end he stood up and applauded with the most emphatic appreciation in the room. Isaiah, sitting beside him, did not applaud dramatically. He just looked at me at the front of the room and nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod that was, she had learned, his version of being eloquent. There was a Christmas supper at the boarding house, and Mae had helped cook, an act that Isaiah had received with the same precise attention he gave all her actions, noting it, accounting for it, fitting it into the portrait he was assembling of who she was. She was beginning to assemble her own portrait of him, piece by piece. He was fiercely honest, to the point where he would sometimes say things that would have been more comfortable left unsaid, but never cruelly, always with a care for the person on the receiving end that made the honesty bearable. He was methodical and practical, a man who solved problems by working through them step by step, who did not catastrophize and did not minimize. He was funny, quietly, in a way that required you to be paying attention to catch it. And when you caught it, the reward was disproportionately great. He was, underneath the careful management of himself, a man of enormous feeling that had been dammed up by grief and made into something he controlled rather than something that moved through him. Mae could see the pressure of it sometimes. in the way he would look at Eli with an almost fierce tenderness, or in the way he stood at the kitchen window in the early morning before anyone else was up, just standing, with a mug of coffee and the gray dawn, and whatever it was that he was carrying. She was in love with him. She had been trying not to be, and she had failed, and she had stopped trying. They moved slowly, appropriately, in the way of two people who have both been damaged in different directions, and who are moving toward each other with the care of people carrying something fragile. He would sit beside her at supper, which he had not done before December. He found reasons to be in the same room with her in the evenings that were plausible reasons, and also clearly more than that. He asked her about her days, specifically and with genuine interest, and listened to her answers with the quality of attention that made her feel that what she was saying was worth hearing. He held her hand for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in January when they were walking back from church along the cold Main Street, and Eli was running ahead of them because he had spotted something interesting in the general store window, and Isaiah reached out without ceremony and took her hand and held it and kept walking, and Mae felt the warmth of it move from her hand up her arm and into the center of her chest. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They did not discuss it. They did not need to. In February, with Eli safe asleep upstairs and the boarding house quiet and the other boarders occupied, Isaiah kissed her in the kitchen over the remains of a dish they had been washing up together. It was not dramatic. He had simply turned to her, and she had turned to him, and the space between them had, by some mutual quiet agreement, closed. The kiss was brief and careful and completely certain. The kiss of two people who have been building toward something for long enough that, when it arrives, it feels like fact rather than accident. When they separated, Mae looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then she smiled, and she felt the rare, specific warmth of his smile in return, the full one that she had been given so seldom that each instance felt like an event. "Mae Merritt," he said quietly, and nothing else, and her name in his voice had all the weight of everything he had been holding back and was now beginning to let go of. Spring came to the Texas plains in the way spring comes to the plains, which is without apology and all at once, the brown grass going green in what seemed like a single week, the air losing its knife edge and becoming something that could be breathed without bracing for it, the sky returning to its proper vast blue after months of pewter. The school board made Mae's position permanent in March, and she received the news standing in Mrs. Garfield's parlor with a composure that lasted exactly until she was back on the street, at which point she did a single, private, completely undignified thing with her arms that she would not have wanted anyone to witness. Isaiah was the first person she told, and his response was to look at her with the full warmth of his expression and say, "Of course," as though the result had never been in question, and she had not realized how much she needed someone to be completely unsurprised by her success until he was. Eli, told at supper, responded by standing up and making a formal announcement to the table that Miss Mae was going to be the teacher forever, which caused Holly's bean to start a round of applause and Mrs. Purvis to say, "Well done, dear," with the first real warmth Mae had heard from her, and which caused Isaiah to put his hand over his mouth and look at his plate, but not before Mae saw the expression on his face. In April, Isaiah asked her to marry him. He did not make an occasion of it in the sense of fanfare. He asked her in the kitchen, always the kitchen, she would notice afterward, the warm, practical heart of the house on a Monday morning before school, over coffee, and he asked her with the directness that was his most consistent quality, looking at her with his whole expression open and clear, and saying that he had loved her since November and that he wanted to make a life with her, and that he was asking her to be his wife if she would have him. And if the timing was wrong or if there were things she needed first, he would wait. Mae set down her coffee cup. "Isaiah Rhodes," she said, "I have been in love with you since you told me that whatever I was carrying could wait until I had rested, and I have been trying to talk myself out of it ever since, and I am done doing that." He said, "Is that a yes?" "That is an emphatic yes," she said. He took her face in his hands carefully, like something precious, and also like something real that would not break, and kissed her with the full warmth of a man no longer managing his own feeling from behind a wall, and she kissed him back with equal fullness, and the kitchen was full of morning light. Eli found out approximately 40 minutes later, because in a boarding house there are no truly private mornings, and his response was to go completely still for 3 whole seconds, and then produce an expression of such concentrated, triumphant satisfaction that Mae understood, with a sudden clarity, that the small boy who had been saving her seat every night before anyone else could think of it had understood from the beginning what none of the adults had yet admitted. "I knew it," Eli said. "You knew it," Mae agreed. "I told Papa," Eli said, looking at his father. "I told him you were the right one." Isaiah looked at his son with the expression Mae loved most on his face, the open, helpless tenderness of a man who has been outmaneuvered with complete kindness by a 7-year-old and has absolutely no objection to it. "You told me she was good," he said. "I worked the rest out myself." "I saved her seat every night," Eli said, as though this explained everything, which in a way it did. They were married in June, in the Redemption Church, on a morning that was already warm by the time the ceremony started, with the doors propped open to catch any air that was passing through. Mrs. Garfield provided flowers from her garden, which were yellow and white and generous. Holly's being cried in a way he did not attempt to hide. Mrs. Purvis wore her best black dress and said afterward that it had been the most sensible wedding she had attended in years. Eli stood beside his father as a very small and completely serious best man, wearing a shirt that had been pressed so carefully it looked like it had opinions about wrinkles, and he watched the ceremony with the focused attention he brought to everything important. When Isaiah put the ring on Mae's finger and turned to face her with the full, open expression she had learned was his real face, his true face, the one underneath all the careful management and the grief walls, Mae felt the specific and complete solidity of a thing that has been built correctly, piece by piece, without rushing, without pretending, with honesty and patience and a 7-year-old boy's absolute insistence that she be given a place at the table. She looked out at the small congregation, the faces of the town that was becoming her town, the classroom full of children who were becoming hers to teach, the house that was becoming hers to live in, and thought that she had arrived in Redemption, Texas, in October of 1883 with a stone in her pocket and a lie in her letter of introduction. And she was standing now in June of 1884 with all of it transformed into something she would not have known how to ask for because she had not known it was possible. She thought of the first evening, the chair scraped back, the small arms spread wide, the absolute and unwavering certainty. That seat is taken. She thought it was taken before I even got there. They moved into the boarding house as a family, which was what they had already been for months, and was now simply the name they were using. Mae kept teaching, and Isaiah kept the house, and Eli went into the first grade in the fall, which was a transition he handled with the comprehensive confidence of a boy who already considered the schoolroom his own particular territory. He sat in the third row, not the front row, because, he explained to me with great seriousness, the third row was where you could see everything, and also the teacher could see you easily when you had something important to say. Mae taught him with the same care she brought to all her students, and perhaps slightly more love, and made sure to never make it obvious, and everyone knew and no one minded. The autumn of 1884 was the best autumn Mae had known in her life, full and warm and anchored. She taught her expanding classroom enrollment had grown to 22 children, including several new homesteader families who had come in from the West, and came home each evening to a house that was hers, and to Isaiah's quiet attention and the specific warmth of a man who showed love through presence and practicality, and who was, she discovered, capable of genuine tenderness in the private moments of their marriage that made all his public restraint feel not like a limitation, but like the patience of someone who understood the value of what was held in reserve. There were complications, because there always are. In November, a man arrived from Hargrove, not Thomas Creech, but a representative of the business interests of Hargrove, someone attempting to track down a debt claim against Mae's cousin, which had been incorrectly attributed and which required some weeks of correspondence to untangle. The man stayed 2 nights at the boarding house and brought with him the cold air of Mae's dark past, not as threat but as reminder, and Mae found herself sitting with the old stone in her coat pocket again, the weight of Hargrove, the accumulated anger and humiliation of having been blamed for something done to her. She told Isaiah all of it, not the brief version she had given him in the barn, but the full version, the details she had kept to herself because she had not known yet whether he could hold them. He listened to all of it with the same level attention he gave everything important, and when she was finished he said, "I am sorry that happened to you. I am sorry that the people around you chose the easier thing over the right thing, and I am glad you left because you came here. It was not complicated. It was not an attempt to fix it or minimize it. It was acknowledgement, full and clear, and it did something to the weight of the stone, not removing it, because the stone of that kind of injustice does not simply disappear but changing what it was, making it historical, making it something that had happened to her in the past and not something that was still happening. She did not cry in front of him. She cried later, privately, the kind of crying that is not grief but relief, the release of something long held. In the spring of 1885, Mae told Isaiah she was expecting. She told him on a Thursday morning in March, sitting at the kitchen table with the spring light coming in at a low angle through the east window, and she had spent the previous 2 days trying to find the right moment, and then realizing there was no strategic right moment for a thing like this. You simply had to say it. She said it. Isaiah went very still in the way he went still when something important was happening, and then he looked at her with an expression that she would carry the exact image of for the rest of her life, not performed happiness, but the real thing, the involuntary kind, the kind that comes from somewhere underneath all the composed management and says, without any possibility of correction, "This is exactly what I wanted." He reached across the table and took her hand. "All right," he said quietly, which was Isaiah's way of saying something enormous. "All right," she agreed. Eli was informed that evening and responded with such comprehensive and detailed enthusiasm about the prospect of a sibling that it lasted through supper and most of the walk to bed, including a very specific period of planning about what kinds of things the baby would need and what he, Eli, would be prepared to teach it. "I will teach it how to find the best seat at supper," Eli announced solemnly. Mae looked at Isaiah over Eli's head. Isaiah was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man trying very hard not to laugh. "That is a very important skill," Mae said. "I know," said Eli. "I developed it myself." The baby was born in November of 1885. On a cold and windy night with the doctor in attendance and Isaiah holding Mae's hand with the contained, fierce steadiness of a man who would not allow his own fear to add to her burden, and who managed this successfully until the doctor placed the baby in his arms, and he lost the management entirely and simply stood there with his son, a boy, a small and furious and perfectly healthy boy, and looked at me with streaming eyes that he made no attempt to hide. They named him Thomas. Not after Thomas Creech, emphatically not, but after Mae's grandfather, who had been the first person in her family to tell her that a woman who could read well and reason clearly was a gift to any community that had the sense to use her. Eli received Thomas with the complete and permanent devotion of an older sibling who has been waiting for this specific person. From the first day the baby came home, Eli was a presence watchful, helpful, arriving at his father's elbow when Thomas needed something, taking on small tasks with the earnest efficiency of a boy who has found his calling. When Thomas was old enough to sit in a high chair at the supper table, Eli, without being asked, before the thought had occurred to anyone else, made sure that Thomas's chair was exactly where it needed to be, secure and stable and right, every single evening. Mae watched it happen one evening in the autumn of 1886, Eli positioning Thomas's chair with the same instinctive, prior attention he had once given to Mae's empty seat at supper. She looked at Isaiah, who was watching the same thing. "He has always known how to make room for people," Mae said quietly. "Yes," Isaiah said. "He learned it early. His mother had it." He paused. "You have it." She looked at him. He was watching Eli, who was now explaining something to Thomas with great seriousness, while Thomas regarded him with the round, solemn attention of a 1-year-old encountering an important subject for the first time. "Both of you have it," Isaiah said, and the way he said it, quiet, certain, without caveat, was everything. In the winter of 1887, Mrs. Purvis finally moved in with her son, having apparently reached a détente with her daughter-in-law sufficient to make proximity bearable, and Holly's Bean expanded his store and moved into the apartment above it, and the boarding house took on 2 new lodgers, a young widow named Ruth Chen and her mother, who had come west from San Francisco on the promise of a fresh start, and who were exactly the kind of people that Mae had always known how to make room for. Ruth Chen was quiet and observant and watchful in the way of a person who has been a stranger in most of the rooms she has occupied, and Mae noticed her with the particular attention of someone who recognized the posture, the careful composure, the assessment of the room, the trying to figure out the rules before anyone chose to use them against her. She made sure Ruth knew that supper was at 6 and that the parlor was for everyone and that the house ran, as Isaiah had always run it, on the principle of fairness with no exceptions. Ruth looked at her with a steady, appraising look and said, "You have been here a while." "Since '83, Mae said. "It shows," Ruth said, which was a high compliment delivered in Ruth's precise, economical way. The year of 1888 brought the longest, hottest summer Mae could remember, and a drought that pressed against the whole region with the specific malice of weather that has decided to be a crisis. The Priestley family, Jack and Nora's parents, nearly lost their homestead, and Isaiah organized a collective effort among the townspeople to help them through it, the kind of thing he did without announcement or ceremony, simply identifying what was needed and arranging for it to happen. Mae watched him do it and thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to be married to a person who made the world around him more functional by the fact of his presence. Not through drama or heroics, but through the patient and consistent work of someone who had decided that the people near him were worth the effort. She taught her classroom through the summer drought with creative problem-solving on the water and arithmetic lessons that used the drought itself as the mathematical problem to be solved, which at least made the mathematics feel relevant. And by September the drought broke and the Priestley homestead was still standing, and Jack Priestley, who was now 16 and nearly as tall as his father, came to the schoolhouse specifically to tell Miss Mae that he appreciated how she had made arithmetic seem like something a person might actually need. Mae accepted this as the genuine compliment it was. In the spring of 1889, she discovered she was expecting again. She told Isaiah on a Tuesday in April, and this time he simply smiled, the full, real smile, the one that had been rare and was now less rare, the one that had always felt like a gift and still did, and said, "Thomas is going to be beside himself." Thomas was 3.5 and was, in fact, beside himself. He spent 2 weeks asking daily whether the baby was here yet and being informed patiently by Eli, who was now 13 and considered himself an authority on how these things went, that it took a while and he needed to be patient. "How long is a while?" Thomas asked. "Months," said Eli. Thomas looked at him. "That is too long." "Nobody asked you," Eli said, and Mae, listening from the next room, pressed her hand to her mouth. The baby was a girl, born in November, which Mae privately thought was the best month for important arrivals. They named her Clara after Mae's sister, who had written the letter with the useful lie in it, and who had cried extensively when told, via post, that her name was being passed on. Clara Rhodes arrived in the world with an expression of comprehensive opinion that her brothers found hilarious, and her father found immediately familiar, and me found perfectly right, as though the specific stubbornness required to build a life here had been distilled and handed, concentrated, to this next person who was going to need it. Eli was 15 by the time Clara was a year old, and already the young man he was going to be was entirely visible, thoughtful, practical, with his father's steadiness, and something of his mother in the ease with which he moved through the world, and something that was entirely himself, which was the quality of looking at people with the assumption that they were worth looking out for. He had been saving me's seat at supper for 6 years by that point, though the meaning of it had shifted. It was no longer about claiming space for a newcomer, but about something continuous, the habitual acknowledgement that she was his person, and that her place here was specific and certain, and had been decided by him long before the world had gotten around to making it official. She thought about this on a Sunday evening in December of 1890, sitting at the long table in the boarding house dining room with the people who were her family now. Isaiah across from her, steady and warm. Eli at the far end, explaining something to the new surveyor lodger with the patience he had inherited from his father. Thomas on her left, devoting serious attention to his supper with the focused appetite of a 5-year-old boy. Clara in the high chair that had replaced the one Thomas had grown out of, presiding over the meal with the authority of a 1-year-old who has not yet learned that authority requires context. Outside the windows, the Texas December was doing what it did, pressing cold fingers through the glass, rattling the shutters, insisting on itself. Inside, the lamps were lit, and the table was full, and the conversation was the warm and overlapping conversation of people who know each other well enough to interrupt. Isaiah looked at me across the table with the expression that was his daily expression now, not the careful management of his early months or the grief-worn flatness of his widowhood, but the face of a man who was present in his own life, entirely, which was the thing that grief had taken from him, and which had been returned slowly, through the accumulation of ordinary days and the specific patient love of a woman who understood that you did not break down someone else's walls. You simply made yourself a presence outside them, day after day, until the person inside decided it was worth opening the door. He reached across the table and covered her hand briefly with his. A small thing. The kind of small thing that is not small at all. Me smiled at him over the bread basket and the gravy boat and the children and the lamp. She thought about the letter with the lie in it. She thought about the stone in her coat pocket and how it was still there, would always be there in some form, but was no longer the heaviest thing she was carrying. She thought about a dusty October afternoon, a doorway, a scraped chair. She thought about Eli saying, "That seat is taken," with the absolute confidence of someone who does not understand that the world can argue back, and who has never needed to understand it because he has never been wrong. She pressed Isaiah's hand back. Eli at the far end of the table caught her eye and smiled at her, the same smile he had given her that first evening, the smile of a boy who has done the right thing and knows it completely. And me smiled back at him across the length of the table and the years between then and now, across all of it, grateful in a way she could never have put into words for the small person who had decided, before she had even gotten to the table, that her place here was certain. He had been right. He had been right from the beginning. She was home. Thomas chose that moment to announce that he was done with his carrots and wanted pie, and Clara said something emphatic in the 1-year-old language that was probably agreement, and Eli resumed his conversation with the surveyor, and Isaiah squeezed me's hand one more time and let it go, and the boarding house filled with the ordinary golden noise of a family at supper, warm and complete, with all the seats taken.